Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing our lecture series on industrialization. And so specifically today we're going to be talking about this concept of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is a term that was created by Mark Twain. And what essentially it means is that society, to be gilded means that it's glittering on the surface, but corrupt underneath. And so, what Mark Twain, by describing the time period of industrialization as the Gilded Age, what he's saying is that yes, society looks great on the surface. There's this massive amount of wealth that's being generated, but it is in fact corrupt underneath. That yes, some people are getting rich. Yes, there are more jobs. Yes, there are cheaper products out there. But because this version of capitalism is laissez-faire and unregulated, that there are all kinds of people that aren't getting paid enough. They're working too many hours. The political process has been corrupted by political machines. And so everything isn't as beautiful and perfect as it would seem. And so, background of the Gilded Age, what Mark Twain is referring to is, corruption in the political process, particularly under the Grant administration, where, with the exception of like the Harding administration, this is one of the most corrupt administrations in American political history. He's talking about the growth of political machines and the buying of votes to provide services that really the government should probably be providing, and that things aren't as great as they seem. And so, these politicians, because there's not a lot of regulation there, either they're taking advantage. And then the idea that the business is the all consuming kind of motivation in America, that the best people are attracted to going the business route because that's what's going to make you rich. And they're not really attracted to politics and governing, because the only way to get rich in politics is through corruption, or at least that's what he believes. I don't know if that's necessarily true. But I think kind of. So the rich are under industrialization are getting incredibly wealthy. In New York, the finance guys, the business guys, the factory owners are doing incredibly well. Men like Rockefeller and Carnegie are going to amass fortunes the size that nobody has ever seen before. I mean, like, Rockefeller and then later Carnegie and then later JP Morgan are going to make, JP Morgan is going to be so wealthy, he's literally going to bail the American government out of a recession. It's just obscene how much money these guys have, and and then when the average American is just barely getting by. And so we see, on the surface, everything looks great. We're going to see the opera, theater, these gigantic parties, the wealthy, clubs and retreats. And so all of that looks great, but underneath it, maybe not so much. We're going to see that in New York City, Miss Fish is going to throw a dinner party for her dog, that the dog is going to be introduced to society with a $15,000 diamond necklace when the average American is living off of less than $400 a year. That $15,000 diamond necklace, it's lavish spending, it's decadent spending, and that's really going to infuriate a lot of these working class people that are just barely getting by. And they're going to say, look, if you guys as the business owners are profiting this much, you can really afford to pay your workers more. But because this version of capitalism is laissez-faire, the government's not stepping in to say, hey, look, you're allowed to get rich. That's good for everybody, that we have that motivating factor for innovation. But you got to pay your workers a livable wage. You've got to make sure that they're not working all day, every day, so they can pursue their own interests and have some sort of quality of life. And so the workers are looking at this lavish spending and saying, this ain't right. And so the government is going to have to step in to kind of fix these problems because it's not being fixed on its own. So rich are living this high life. Meanwhile, we're going to see that most of America is living off of less than $1,200 a year. Most families are living on less than $1,200 a year. 11 out of the 12 million families. The average annual income is less than $400 a year, and so to get to that 1,200, most families, it's dad's definitely got to work. Mom, if you're poor, mom might be working too. Middle class, women are, because of the cult of domesticity, are trying not to work. But in poor situations, mom probably has to work, and that means the kids are being put to work too. Because of laissez-faire, there's really no laws restricting child labor. And so it's different area to area. Different states have different laws, but just in general, there's no child labor laws. And we don't have a societal problem with children working. As a matter of fact, that's a relatively new occurrence. Children have always been viewed as, up until recent history, have been viewed as an economic boon to the family. Farmers have been putting their young sons to work forever. As a matter of fact, the reason why those agricultural families would have 7 children is they're hoping 4 of them are boys, and those 4 boys will work the farm. So child labor has always been a thing in America. Up until essentially World War II. The difference is, though, when we're an agrarian society, those 4 boys work for their dad, who loves them. And so dad's not going to work them to death. Dad's going to make sure that as long as he's capable, that they're going to have some sort of standard of living, that they're going to be safe. You can't be perfectly safe, but he's going to attempt to make sure that they're safe. Whereas when you're living in a city and you're not working on a farm, but you're working in factories, you're not working. Those 4 boys wouldn't be working for their dad. They're going to be working for somebody else that doesn't care about them, doesn't love them, and doesn't care if they're safe. And so you have a society that doesn't have a problem with child labor. All of a sudden, we're putting those kids into factories, and it becomes, that's a bad situation, right? So the government really at this point isn't providing social services. In a lot of places, they're not picking up the trash. They're not helping you find a job. There's no Medicare or Medicaid, so they're not providing any kind of health insurance or health benefits. There's no disability pay. And because of that, local political machines are going to pick up the slack. Now, the difference between the government and political machines, the government is the official part of the government, right? It's politicians get jobs in the government. And have a whole bureaucracy or series of government workers to do things officially for the government. Political machines are just groups of politicians that promise services to people in return for votes. And so they're actually operating outside of the government in essentially selling services for votes. And they say essentially, if you vote for me, I will make sure somebody comes by and picks up your trash. Or if you need a job, if you vote for me, when I control this city, I'm going to have to hire all the police officers, and I'll hire you. Now, in return for a job, because I have to run this political machine outside of the government, that costs money. And so if I give you a job, I not only need your vote, but I need 10% of your paycheck. When you target the poor and immigrants, they're going to sign up for that all day long because they don't have an alternative. They would rather keep 90% of something than 100% of nothing. And so it's these political machines start to provide services and services that people need in return for votes and bribes. Now, initially, people are okay with that because they're getting something out of it. But eventually, these political machines are going to become fabulously corrupt. And they're going to be stealing from both the government and from citizens. And people will eventually wake up and realize we don't need these political machines. We just need to get our government to do the things that these political machines are doing for us that we like. And so eventually, we're the people will turn against political machines. But in the meantime, in the beginning, if these political machines are going to be providing more services for people than the actual government. And so people are okay with the arrangement, at least initially. So I'm going to have a sip of coffee here real quick. Right. By the beginning of the 20th century, which means the 1900s, the major economic centers, banking, manufacturing, oil refinery, the ironworks and steelworks, railroads, meat packing in places like Chicago, are going to start to be dominated by a small number of corporations that are consolidating power. We talked about in the previous lecture about vertical and horizontal integration that is starting to happen. And because of that, we're starting to see a decline in some of these craftsmen, small businesses, and these giant corporations that have this giant infrastructure that are going to, become very powerful. And the more powerful they get, the more they can, drop the wages of workers and increase hours because you just have fewer options to go and work someplace else. And so this is going to start to become a problem. So we see that the 19th century we're moving into this industrial economy, and by the time we get to the 20th century, we're going to be gangbusters into industrialization. We're going to start to see by the time we get through World War One, we're going to see that America's industrial production will become the highest in the world, and so we are going to by the time we get to World War Two, we're going to be outproducing essentially every other nation on the planet combined. I mean, that's how massive our economy is. And so, we are definitely going to be criticizing laissez faire capitalism here. There's no doubt about it because, when capitalism is allowed to operate without any rules, bad things are going to happen to workers. But at the other end of that, once you start to regulate capitalism and you start to make sure that these businesses don't abuse their workers, it is going to create, hands down, what is the strongest economy in the history of the world, and is going to create the essentially the wealthiest, country and citizens in the entire world. I think we've said it before. If you are born in America and you have a full time job, you are almost certainly in the top 1% of wage earners in the world. And so, this industrial growth is going to be what makes that happen. The corporation starts to become the dominant business form. So you form a corporation, that corporation will own a whole bunch of other smaller businesses. And it's just a way to organize your business on a massive scale. Now, in a laissez faire capitalist system where there's no regulation, these corporations will become super powerful. They're going to be able to buy out the politicians, and they're going to be able to use their gigantic size to drive down wages, drive up hours, manipulate prices if they're a monopoly. And so we'll need to start to regulate those monopolies to make sure we get a competitive, free, but regulated form of capitalism. So at this point, we've got very little regulations. They can pay their workers whatever they want. They can make them work as many hours as they want. The conditions don't have to be safe. The government stance on this is, well, if that factory is unsafe, quit and go work somewhere else. Well, if everybody's unsafe, then what are you going to do? So that ends up becoming a real problem. Because of that, workers are going to start to realize that this is untenable. You can't keep this up. And so they're going to start to organize, because at the end of the day, an individual worker has no power over their boss. If I go to my boss and say, "You're mistreating me," my boss can just say, "Bye, you're fired." But if I organize with the rest of my workers and I say, "Boss, you're mistreating all of us, you got to stop," the boss isn't going to be able to fire all of us, and so we might be able to negotiate some change. The problem is, early in industrialization, the workers haven't figured out how to organize yet, and there's been lots of laws passed that are going to limit their ability to organize. And so, we talk about laissez faire, where businesses are free to do whatever they want, but then there's restrictions on workers. And so that's not good, right? And that's not a fair system. And so, we need businesses to be able to be free enough to invent new products, products and create new jobs. But we also need workers to be free enough to be able to organize themselves and demand higher wages and negotiate for their true value in labor. And so we have a lopsided system in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Eventually workers will realize that if they want to be able to force their boss into paying them what they believe they're worth, that they're going to have to go on strike or essentially stop working until they get their wages. Well, those strikes will ultimately turn out to be violent. The business owners will call in strike breakers. They'll hire criminals to go beat up the strikers. The strikers, the businesses will try and hire scabs or other workers that are willing to cross the picket line to work for the reduced wages, because there's always some of those out there. And so sometimes the violence is because the business owner hires people to beat up the strikers. Sometimes the violence is because the strikers beat up the scab workers that are trying to cross the picket line. And sometimes it's the government. The business leaders will call in the government. The government will come in, and almost always initially, until we get into the 1920s, 1930s, most of the time the government will side with business owners and say, you as workers can't interfere with the private property of that owner, and the government will come in and violently remove the strikers. And so, we haven't found that balance. It's really kind of, Teddy Roosevelt is going to help us strike that balance. We'll talk about him later. So these political machines that we had talked about earlier are dominating the political process. As a matter of fact, essentially every major city is going to be controlled by a group of politicians that are selling services for votes. Both political parties have them. They're in every major city: New York, Chicago, St. Louis. Just name the city. Even small towns have their own basic political machines. They generally work from the bottom up, meaning the most important person is the voter. And so because that's you got to have the vote to get the politician in power. And so these political machines are going to cater to the needs of the voters, take care of the voter first to make sure the politician stays in power. And so what they would do is pick up trash. If your grandma got sick, they would help pay for them to go to a doctor. They would help police the neighborhoods. Even though there are police officers, then they're going to make sure that things get done properly in your neighborhood in return for your vote. And then they're also going to help you find work. And this is where the political machines would line their pockets as well. So if you were a new immigrant, say, and they're really going to target immigrants because they're the most vulnerable. And so they'll say, hey, look, new immigrant, we'll help you get your citizenship. That's the first thing they do. Well, they have to do that because you got to be a citizen before you have a vote. Then they say, immigrant, we will, immigrant A, whoever they are, we will help you get registered. We'll help you get registered to vote after you become a citizen, and then we'll give you a job as long as you vote for us. Now, with that job, you keep 90% of your paycheck, and for us to be able to run this process, you're going to have to kick back 10% to us. It's called a kickback. And so, most immigrants will say, "Yeah, this is way better than the situation before," and they're going to say, "Fine, I'm willing to do that." And so, that's why you have this tradition of like Irish policemen in Boston. It's because the political machine, when the Irish first came to the United States, they would, it's the political machines that said, "Hey, look, if you elect me, I control who the cops are. I control the hiring for that. And so vote for me and I'll get you a job if you pay that kickback." And they took it because it's clearly the only thing to do. You would rather have 90% of something rather than, 100%. And so there's a lot of focus on new immigrants. But there's also massive stealing involved. And so the other way that these kickbacks and bribes would work is government's also in charge of not just hiring people, but they're also in charge of building stuff: schools, roads, bridges. And so these political machines would essentially, would say, "Hey, look, if you own construction company X, we can hire you if you want to make some money. We'll hire you to build the school, but to get the bid, what I want you to do is I want you to overbid. So if it costs $1 million to to make these numbers up, $1 million to actually build the school and make a profit. I want you to charge $2 million. And we'll split that extra $1 million, 50% for you, 50% for me. And then you have to, when you build the school, you have to hire all my guys. And so all those people that vote for me, so you give my guys jobs. And so, at first people are going to be okay with that because they're hiring, people are getting jobs, they're getting a new school out of it. But eventually what people are going to start to realize is if you're stealing from the government, who are you really stealing from? Us, the taxpayers. And so, there's more efficient ways to do this. And so as people like Boss Tweed, his Tammany Hall ring, are stealing all this money, they're going to get caught doing it. And so as they get caught doing it, people realize, well, this is wrong. We're overpaying for this stuff. Our government should just do this stuff because they work for us, not to help line their own pockets. Guys like Boss Tweed get super, super wealthy out of situations like this. This is Boss Tweed, who is in charge of Tammany Hall, which was the name of the political machine in New York City. He stole millions from the city. He controlled New York with an iron fist. Like I said before, he would any construction project in New York that the government was involved in, they would require bribes from companies to be able to build those things. And so you just see massive amounts of stealing. And then he takes that money and he gives some of it back to the people, but he enriches his friends, just complete. It's complete theft. And this is what happens when these political machines get out of hand. Guys like Thomas Nast are going to be able to start to draw attention to the Boss Tweed's ring, and he's going to do it through political cartoons. These cartoons are important because most of the poor people in New York at the time can't read, so Boss Tweed doesn't care about the articles being written about him because doesn't matter. The average person that votes for him doesn't read those articles. But it's going to be political cartoons like this one, who stole the people's money, with everybody pointing at somebody else. That's going to start to, raise eyebrows. This one takes a little bit of intelligence to figure this out, right? Because you got to be able to read who stole the people's money. And then you got to be smart enough to realize that Boss Tweed and all his cronies are pointing at somebody else, not willing to take responsibility. You got to have some thought here. But political cartoons like this one, you don't. Right? This is clear. There's very few words here. The words that are out there are completely recognizable. So you see clearly that's Boss Tweed's face on a vulture. We know what vultures do. They prey on the dead. They're carrion, right? I mean, it's like they're nasty. They're associated with death and dying. And so Boss Tweed is this vulture, and he's gripping the dead body of something. So we all recognize like this is not good. And so it's a Tweed associated with something not good. The word New York is written on the arm of the body that he's gripping. Now, even if you can't read, if you live in New York, you recognize that word New York. And so it's clearly Boss Tweed is a fat vulture feeding on New York City. There's other bones that maybe you can recognize those words. It's like law and justice. And so he's, killing these things and feeding on them. And this is the type of thing that Boss Tweed can't stand, because the average voter can look at that and say, hey, why are they saying that Boss Tweed is feeding off of New York City? What's he doing that's wrong? Oh, he's stealing our tax money. Wait, you mean it's not okay that he's taking part of my paycheck? You mean to tell me that the government should be providing these services and not the political machines, and that they should do it in an efficient way that doesn't require theft? Wait, huh? This guy's not, I thought he was a good guy. He's not a good guy. And so eventually it's things like this that are going to bring down the political machines. Grant is going to play a part in this, and not because he's cleaning it up, but because he gets exposed as having a very corrupt administration. Grant himself isn't corrupt. He's a good dude, but he's a general. He probably is not supposed to be a president, right? He's not this great political mind. And, just because you're good at winning a war and you're an American hero doesn't necessarily mean you're fit to run a country. And so when Grant becomes president, he's going to give the people that have been around him his whole life, he's going to give them jobs in the government. He's loyal. And in the military, loyalty is crucial, right? If you're going to fight and kill and die, you definitely need loyalty there. But in politics, you don't really necessarily need loyalty. I mean, you always want loyalty, but that's not the most important value. In the government, what we really want is competency. We want you to be intelligent and capable, and that's what we want. So he's going to hire people in the government that are loyal to him and to their other friends, but aren't exactly capable. And he's not going to necessarily pay attention to the morality of these men. And so he appoints his friends to these high-level jobs, and they just start to steal from the American people. The Treasury Secretary, the guy that's like in charge of finances and collecting of taxes for the government, is collecting illegal taxes. He's charging people extra money. I mean, this is like, as a citizen, like, that's the worst thing you could ever do. Like, you're overcharging me taxes and stealing my money. Like, get out of here, right? And so Treasury Secretary is stealing. The Secretary of War is getting kickbacks for patronage jobs. Patronage jobs just means, the people who vote for me and are loyal to me, when I get in office, I'll give them government jobs, and then they could potentially give me a kickback. It's what the political machines were doing. His Secretary of War does that. And his vice president gets caught up in the credit mobilier scandal, which we talked about in a previous lecture. Go back to the Frontier lecture series and look at the railroad, Transcontinental Railroad, and the Union Pacific, the essentially fake construction company that manipulated stock prices to steal from your average investors. And so this is, the Grant administration is, maybe with the exception of the Harding administration, one of the most corrupt administrations out there. And because of that, we're going to start to see for calls to clean up our government and make sure that our government isn't corrupt in this way. And so by 1883, we'll get the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act is going to be put in place to try to end that patronage system, or what we also called during the Jackson lectures, the spoils system. So Jackson really kind of created the spoils system. He said, when I get elected, I'm going to appoint my people. Now, it's not wrong for a president to appoint his people to office because, he wants to get an agenda across. And if he doesn't appoint his people that want that agenda, then he won't be able to get that agenda across. And that's what the American people voted him into office for. But the spoil system has now turned into, I'm going to appoint my friends, whether or not they're good at their job. So we want our president to appoint his people to office, but we also want those people to be qualified. So what happened during the Grant administration doesn't happen in the future. And that's what the Pendleton Act is going to try to do. The Pendleton Act is going to create the Civil Service Commission that says, yes, the president can appoint people, but those people have to essentially go through the Civil Service Commission and establish that they are qualified to do their job. So if you're a Treasury Secretary, you actually have to know something about finance, right? And so the candidates have to compete through these exams to prove that they're qualified. And so this is going to make sure that those people can actually do their job in the government, because if they can't, then what are we paying them for? And so eventually it's going to be President Arthur who is going to really have this system start under his administration. But it's going to start slowly, because just like anything else, you can't just go, overnight, have this drastic change. We're only going to have about 10% of government jobs have to go through the Civil Service Commission. Now, that number will definitely increase over time. So, we'll see an increase in the qualifications of government workers over time. It'll never be 100%, but the idea is for the most important jobs, you got to be qualified to to be in that position. So, the Gilded Age, what is it? Well, one, it's an era of conspicuous consumption. Well, what do I mean by conspicuous consumption? I mean, the wealthy are essentially flaunting their wealth. It means $15,000 dog collars. It means gigantic mansions. It means yacht clubs and things of that nature. And so that's the Gilded Age glittering on the surface, right? But it is also corrupt underneath. There's this massive greed. These people are hoarding the wealth at the top instead of doing the right thing and making sure that their employees are also taken care of, which Ford will do later. And he recognizes the need for that if you really want to make money, Ford recognizes you have to have the best workers. And if you want the best workers, you got to pay them. So business owners will, the smart ones will figure it out on their own. But most of them are going to have the government intervene to make sure that they're not just amassing all this wealth and not making sure that there's at least a minimum standard of wages and hours worked. Right. And then unfettered capitalism. That means no rules capitalism, which is not a good thing. The capitalist system, although it is definitely the greatest wealth creator and economic system in the world, it definitely creates the highest standard of living in the world. It also makes societies less prone to warfare. There's no doubt about it. The more countries trade together, the less likely they are to go to war with each other. I mean, right now in 2020, we're living through one of the most peaceful eras in the history of the world, and that's directly to do with the spread of capitalism. But unfettered capitalism, unregulated capitalism has massive problems with wages, hours worked, safety conditions, child labor, no disability, no workman's comp, nothing like that. So unfettered capitalism is not a good thing. All right. And so you're also seeing during this time period the switch from an agrarian rural population. So that means agrarian means farming, rural means out in the countryside, to an urban industrial society, which means urban means cities and industrial means manufacturing or factory jobs. So we're starting that transition that will go all the way up into the 1920s. And then, later around the 1950s, we'll start to be moving into a suburban society. And we'll talk about that in a later lecture. All right, that concludes our lecture for today. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you again shortly.